I hope this works, obviously. And good morning to all of you. And welcome to the second and last day of this Macedonia 2025 summit that we are starting with this panel on tackling corruption in the government, Guardians of Integrity. And we have our panelists here in 1 hour approximately, as one of them has to fly out right after the session. We'll try to talk about this hard topic. I know most of you partied hard yesterday and last night, but we have to work even harder today to justify that. So without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers for the panel. On my left side, first apology that Eka Gigauri from Georgia is not here. I was not able to come because of the protest going on in Georgia again around laws tackling corruption and money laundering, so we excuse her. And unfortunately, it's only male panel, but that will survive this, hopefully. So, Boris Andrijanic from Slovenia, former Minister for Digital Transformation, but also with insights in digital policy, as they say, now in Kumo.ai. From the speaker yesterday, you heard Vanja Josifovski, so they are on this interesting endeavor. Then we have Sashe Dimitroff, who is a lawyer specialized in international arbitration. And as far as I know, Macedonia has quite a cases on the arbitration courts, unfortunately. And from the US Embassy, at the end, Jason Corley, who is legal advisor, and as I heard, federal prosecutor in Texas. And Sashe is also from Texas, so I hope Houston will not have a problem today with the session. So, as you know, myself, I'm director of the Macedonian Center for International Cooperation, a local foundation, probably by budget currently the number one in the country, that works a lot in helping other non-governmental or non-profit organizations, and in general civil society development, but also in last few years working a lot in corruption. We are managing currently the biggest program that USAID is supporting in the country, Citizens Against Corruption, and there is another one, Partnership Against Corruption. So the focus of the US government is quite a lot on tackling corruption, that according to our researches in the last 3 years is the problem number one in the country. And we had an elections a few days ago, and as if you followed, the rhetoric was a lot about tackling this problem and fighting corruption and prosecuting wrongdoings in the past. I'll not debate now, but maybe later in the panel. So let's start with Mr. Andrijanic here, who has experience in the region, in Slovenia particularly, and even we used that part of that experience. We brought another minister with the current government, outgoing government started. We brought the minister that made the transformation in Slovenia about the civil society, and this government promised to do the same, but after 7 years, nothing of that. So let's hear how to do it, or how it was done in Slovenia, and how digital transformation helped fight corruption as well in Slovenia. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question, and congratulations to the organizers for a truly amazing event. I'm super impressed, and I can't wait to come back. Now, obviously, corruption is a depressing issue, but I'll still try to be a bit optimistic. Why? Simply because we have very effective tools to fight it. And these tools are oftentimes digital. And we've seen it being implemented again and again, even with countries that have, believe it or not, worse issues with corruption than Macedonia. And in particular, I would like to single out not Slovenia, luckily, but Ukraine. So Ukraine has done an incredible job in digital transformation in the past couple of years. They've done two things in particular. First of all, they implemented the most advanced digital government app in the world. It's government in a smartphone concept, which allows you to access all government services with your smartphone. Everything, from ordering new documents to getting the building permit, from using your app to identify yourself instead of, bearing a physical passport or whatever else. And let me tell you one interesting piece of fact. During the previous Football World Cup, over 2 million Ukrainians were watching the finals over this government app. It's just an amazing thing. It's open source, and it's waiting for governments around the world, including Macedonia, to implement it. This is one thing. The second thing is e-procurement. They've enacted several years ago a platform called Prozoro. I'm talking about Ukraine still. Prozoro managed to decrease corruption, according to international estimates, by 25% and lower the procurement budgets by 10%, saving Ukraine over $3 million a day. So this platform basically allows for online bidding, and it scrutinizes over 4,000 bids for different kind of procurement processes a day. So if Ukraine was able to do it, I'm very certain that Macedonia can do it too. And again, these are tools that are open source and are waiting to be implemented by the new government, and I can't wait to help them out in doing so.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. And as at one point we were kind of presented as leaders in digital transformation in the previous government, and I think Marta Tomovska was one of the speakers on the previous summit, so she's helping Serbia instead of Macedonia, but hopefully we can combine these efforts and get back to tackle corruption here. Let's move in the first round to Sashe Dimitroff now, who is following how corruption affects the businesses and how businesses are deciding where to invest related to the issues of corruption. So he has a presentation, so he will come and he will ask you some questions during that. So basically, the first question will be how corruption is measured internationally and how these companies are, foreign companies are considering to invest based on also those things. Sasha.
Yeah, so usually I give this presentation at legal conferences, but I understand there are some lawyers here, but frankly I would bore the audience out of their minds if we talked about cases. So I want to approach this from a different perspective, which is how do businesses make decisions? How do foreign businesses make decisions to invest in Macedonia? And I think the best way to summarize it is perspective versus perception. So perception is what I perceive. Perspective is looking at it from your perspective, in other words, how you see it. If you look at the perception of corruption from the Macedonian government, we have a new government. There's going to be judicial reforms within the first couple of months. I think everyone hopes that they're successful. And from that perception, will that fix the corruption problem? Certainly it's the start. But from the perspective of a foreign investor, the decision's really different. The question for a business person, if I'm going to invest in a foreign country, I want to have certainty. I want to control risk. I want to be treated fairly. So what's my business exposure if there's corruption in my investment, and how's that going to be affected by the government? One example is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Venezuela had amazing oil fields, and Chevron, Exxon, all of these US companies came and invested billions of dollars in developing these oil fields. Hugo Chavez came into power and took them away, nationalized all of them, and that investment disappeared. So how do you evaluate those kind of risks because of political corruption or political influence? And what recourses do I have? One more example, I do a lot of work for the energy industry, and some of the best oil and gas in the world comes from Nigeria. The purest oil, plenty of it. When Exxon from Houston decides he wants to enter into concession with the Nigerian government, one of the most notoriously corrupt governments in the world, they'll enter the concession, but the Americans don't want to go to the Nigerian courts if something goes wrong with the deal. The Nigerians don't want to have a jury trial in Houston, Texas. So they decide on something different, international arbitration. And what it basically does is controls the risk. For those of you that don't know, international arbitration is a private dispute resolution. And what we agree is, I'm going to pick one person that's going to decide the case. You're going to pick one person that decides the case. And those two are going to pick a third person. And these are private individuals. They're going to choose a neutral set of laws, so not Macedonian laws, not American laws, but let's say English laws. They're going to go to a neutral place, London, so there's no influence. And that decision will be binding upon the parties. We'll talk about enforcement of that later. But the question here is, if I'm a foreign business person and I want to consider the safety of my investment, the certainty of my investment, how do I measure corruption? Notoriously difficult to measure, but there's an organization called Transparency International, and it created something called the Corruption Perception Index. Remember, it's perception versus perspective. But the Corruption Perception Index is based on independent surveys of NGOs like the World Bank and other think tanks. And what they basically did was ranked 180 countries and gave them a score from 0 to 100. Think of they call it the Corruption Perception Index, or the CPI index, CPI. And the score of 0 is it's like a school exam. If you get a 0, that's terrible. It's a very corrupt country. If you get 100, you're perceived as having very little or no corruption. So here's a question for the audience. If you'll put up the first question. From 0 to 100, 0 being the most corrupt, 100 being the least corrupt, what do you think is Macedonia's CPI score? All right, we have the results, and they are 35 wins. Let's put up the first slide of the PowerPoint. The answer is 42. Out of the 180 countries ranked, Macedonia is ranked 76th in terms of corruption perception. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the table, and if you keep up that slide number 1, go back? Yep, right there. If you look at that chart on the side, it changes over time. In 2017, we had a corruption perception of 45, but there were a number of scandals. There were a number of government scandals that changed the perception of corruption in Macedonia, and it went down dramatically. In recent years, it's gone back up, but the perception index, based on the ongoing corruption in the country, changes, and it's public information. Let me have another audience participation question. How does Macedonia compare to her neighbors? If you'll answer those questions, who's more corrupt and who's less corrupt? Interesting. Let's put up the second PowerPoint slide, please. Macedonia is 42, Serbia, higher perceived corruption of 36, Bosnia, 35, Albania, 37. And take a look at the surrounding countries, and it kind of gives you the idea, if a foreign investor is going to choose in the Balkans or in the surrounding area, and they're doing a business evaluation, what's the perception of the safety of that investment? And let's just, for the fun of it and the context, let's take a look at the least corrupt countries. Please put up question number 3. Of these, which do you think is voted with the lowest CPI, the least corrupt country in the world according to Transparency International? The answer?
Nobody will say.
Denmark, number 1, least corrupt. On the CPI index, remember there are 180 countries ranked. Denmark is ranked as number 1 of the 180. Singapore has a score of 83, ranked number 5. Canada, number 12, ranked with a CPI of 76. United States, ranked number 24. Now, here's the question. What does that mean as far as international arbitration, as far as this ability to sue outside the country? There's an increased number of cases. In Macedonia had 12 years ago, something interesting happened. Macedonia had never been sued in international tribunals. It had never had an foreign investor sue them outside of Macedonia in an international arbitration tribunal. The very first 2 investor cases started about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. There have been 10 since, but the most interesting thing is the last 4 years, 5 were filed. 250% increase over the last 5 years. And the message seems to be that foreign investors may not trust Macedonian courts. So the perception index, I think, is a wonderful way of measuring risk, and certainly in comparison to surrounding countries and when a foreign investor decides where to put their money. Yeah.
Thank you for this, and I can add actually, because we do a bit more in-depth surveys on corruption, which are not only based on perception but on real experience. And based on that, Macedonia is somewhere in the middle of the Balkan region, but all region is quite low, as we saw also in this index. And one of the main indicators is that 36% of the people were asked for a bribe. So every third person was asked for a bribe in Macedonia, and 30% gave the bribe. So almost everybody actually participated in it was very low resistance on corruption. We are in the middle. There are some countries that are worse, that are some countries that are a bit better, but quite far from this. But we'll come to that because we also have already some questions. But let's hear from our first speaker, Jason Corley, from the U.S. Embassy here, who serves as a legal advisor. And as I told you, United States is putting quite a significant effort, because I follow how they fund these programs around the world, and Macedonia is now one of the targeted 10 countries in the world with significant, it's about $18 million investment, let's say, or programs that are intended for fighting corruption strictly in Macedonia, not in the region, but for Macedonia. So they perceive as well, probably following the index, that this is a problem number one to be tackled. So from your perspective, Jason, how this international collaboration or cross-border cooperation can contribute in fighting corruption and lessening the burden here in Macedonia, and maybe having your legal background, what the legislative framework what can be done with the legislation to reduce the possibilities for corruption in the country.
So first of all, thank you from the United States Embassy for the invitation to be here. It's really wonderful, and the opportunity to speak with everybody. My background, I'm a federal prosecutor back in the United States. I worked in South Texas on the border for a number of years, and then in Houston in the organized crime section for a number of years, before being detailed to the Middle East on counterterrorism work, and then I was reassigned here to Skopje. It's wonderful being here. I've been here 5 months. I love this country, so I'm still learning it, but it's good being here. To your first question on international cooperation, I think there's two different categories for that. The first is international standards and norms and development, which is my responsibility here, bringing my experience from the United States as a federal prosecutor to this country and providing training and development and assistance to prosecutors and judges here. And I think there is quite a bit of international cooperation in that arena in terms of development. Sometimes there may be too many cooks in the kitchen, to be honest with you, but that type of cooperation is obviously important to bring up the standards and norms in countries that have partnerships. The other cooperation is equally important and probably goes unseen, and that's the operational cooperation. So there's a mechanism called mutual legal assistance. In the United States, the Department of Justice's Office of International Affairs handles requests for mutual legal assistance, and they are very busy. As a prosecutor in the United States, most of the evidence that I need in most of my cases are going to be pieces of evidence in the United States. If I want to do a stored communication search warrant for people's Instagram accounts or Google accounts or whatever it is that I want access to, it's located in the Northern District of California. I submit a search warrant to Google, I get access to that stuff. For countries around the world that want access to social media evidence, which is becoming increasingly important in all prosecutions, those requests have to go through the Department of Justice, which would then facilitate the requests for that evidence. Likewise, you're not going to have many corruption cases or organized crime cases without money laundering. And that's a conversation I've been having with folks here in this country. If there's corruption and abuse of office, or if there's organized crime charges, there's going to be money laundering, and you have to follow the money. And increasingly, we're seeing the money in the form of cryptocurrency. And there's only a couple of countries, 3 or 4 countries in the world that can engage in crypto tracing. One of them is the United States. We are capable of doing that. Now, it depends on the case. Obviously, it's a resource-intensive endeavor to engage in cryptocurrency tracing, and so you're not going to do it on a run-of-the-mill case, but we are capable of it. And increasingly, we are seeing criminals engaged in money laundering avoiding the United States on dark web marketplaces and other entities that utilize cryptocurrency for criminal activity. They're avoiding the United States because they know of the availability of crypto tracing in the United States. But to go back to your initial question, international cooperation for money laundering is paramount. You're going to need bank records, and increasingly the money is moving across international borders into different banks. You're going to need the skills and the tools to engage in that financial tracing, and that's some of the things that I'm trying to bring, some of the aspects of what the DOJ does that I'm trying to bring here to increase the pursuit of the money, so to speak, which is how DOJ approaches those types of cases, and there always going to be an international element to that. To your second question, I'm actually less concerned about legislative reform than I am about protecting the judiciary. One thing in the United States that we hold dear, and I don't think many Americans give it much thought, it's just accepted as the way it is that the judiciary in the United States is a co-equal branch of government. They are equal with Congress, they are equal with the president, they stand on their own, and they vigilantly protect that. And that position of the judiciary is over 200 years old. It goes back to a case called Marbury versus Madison in 1803, when the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Marshall asserted their equal stature with the presidency and with Congress, and the independence of a judiciary to stand alone and be able to provide for themselves without political influence is probably, I think, the key issue here outside of legislation that needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you for that comparison, but as we know here, somebody joked in the morning that we should hire you as a public prosecutor for Macedonia because our last one is in jail now. And we are far from getting that independence of judiciary, unfortunately, even after heavy investment from, I think, at least 10% of the 1 billion that the United States government put in Macedonia in these 40 years was for reform of judiciary. But unfortunately, we are not there. Maybe it will take 200 years, but hopefully we can do it in 20.
Hopefully two.
No. But we'll come to that. Let's move back to Mark, as there are some interesting questions already posed here. And one is combining actually what Sashe presented as a CPI index, and it says that actually Ukraine ranks 104th in that index, so quite bad. But you are presenting their case. Maybe it's a recent thing that is going on. So maybe to elaborate more on that, and maybe link it to your own work in Slovenia, how your experience in Slovenia shaped the fight against corruption or promoting good governance in Slovenia, and where Slovenia stands in comparison to this Ukraine software, let's say, or model. And so, for all, just before you go, there is one question that probably wants to tackle the gender balance. So the question is, how many women are included in your anti-corruption team? So all of you think about the role of women in the fight against corruption.
So again, there's no silver bullet. I think what you need is a holistic approach that's all-encompassing and aims at strengthening the judiciary, digitizing your public service, and so on and so forth. And I think what we usually do, and it's a mistake, is try to reinvent the wheel. Instead of just looking around the world and seeing what works, and just copy it. It's not a crime to copy a good idea or a good software solution or a good, judiciary system if it works in a similar setting super well. Now, I would basically add to what Sashe was saying. You see some countries around Macedonia that actually are perceived as being even more corrupt, but are actually able to attract a lot of foreign investors. But those foreign investors, of course, are not coming from the US. They're not coming from Denmark. They're not coming from Slovenia. They're coming from China. They're coming from Russia. They're coming from other places that, know their way in these kind of environments. But that's not the kind of investors you want to attract if you want to become, a super prosperous, modern, and equitable nation. Now, I was talking about digital tools that I think are super important, and let me give you an example. So it wasn't Ukraine that came up with digital government. It was actually Estonia. So today in Estonia, like in Ukraine, you can basically manage all of your public services online. You can get married online. A couple of months ago, they even enabled you to get divorced online. This was before that reserved for, an in-person meeting with the official. Now you can do it all. You can buy a house, open a business. That's it. I think cutting out the middleman is supremely important, because if government services are online, if they're automated, they're not just more convenient, but they also, decrease the opportunities for any kind of corrupt bureaucrats to demand any kind of extra pay. So this, I think, is important. And when you're talking about digitalization of public sector, just think of the transformation that Uber brought to the area of transportation. If you remember how it was a long time ago in most countries to order a cab in a foreign country and to be faced with a very inconvenient surprise at the end of the ride when you got the bill and so on. So in a way, digital is the way to go in terms of increasing transparency. The second thing that was important for us as a government in Slovenia is really to try to, have less of a public service, but better paid. Really try to introduce meritocracy, allow the system to be flexible enough to have the possibility of rewarding the hardworking, the good bureaucrats, so to speak, and also to fire the ones that aren't performing. If you're stuck in a system where, there's no difference whether you work hard or you're corrupt, then good things won't happen. So I think trimming the public sector and really upgrading the pay of your public servants is an important lever towards corruption. Thirdly, in many countries across the Balkans, state-owned enterprises are an incredibly important and detrimental source of corruption in general and political corruption in particular. We've seen it again and again, and that's why I'm definitely not a fan of state ownership. I think state should focus on the services that are absolutely essential to the citizens and do them well. But what we're seeing in many of our countries is that states are failing at their basic cause or basic services, yet again trying to manage complex corporations that span from tourism to banking and insurance and so on and so forth. So again, you need a holistic approach. In Slovenia, I would say we were extremely focused on corruption in healthcare. That's why we established a digital bidding platform for all the procurement within our public healthcare system. It was a success, and it also enabled different hospitals to team up to procure different kind of services or goods together, rather than each of them being on its own. And all of this is done online. Again, we're not there yet, but it was an important step. And when the new government will be formed, I think for them it's super important to map those best practices and take some stuff from Singapore, from Ukraine, from Estonia, and of course from Slovenia.
Thank you, and I hope the new government will take you for advices on this topic and think about the following question from the audience is like what prevents our government in doing so, in digitizing, but think about it. We'll move now to Sashe again and turn back to international arbitration and to hear a bit more on how does international arbitration attracts or detracts investors and deter corruption, and how it can be used for economic growth to link these two goals of zero tolerance of Macedonia 2025, zero tolerance on corruption and achieving economic growth.
I described earlier what international arbitration is, but there's really two types. There's commercial arbitration, which is basically the contract between two parties where three independent people decide what are the contract rights. But for foreign investors, it's a brand new tool. It's not brand new, but there's a tool that's specifically done for foreign investors that are going to invest in a government. And it's called investor state, investor being the foreign investor, the state being the government. And the rights don't come from just the contract. They actually come from treaties. There are treaties that Macedonia signed, 42 of them with various countries, where it said that if your people, let's say Macedonia and Germany, the German government and the Macedonian government agreed that if a German investor comes to Macedonia, they were guaranteed certain rights regardless of what the contract says. Similarly, if a Macedonian investor goes to Germany, they are guaranteed certain rights under the treaty regardless of what the contract says. And these treaties are incorporated into the federal law of the government. So, for example, it is Macedonian national law to give German investors that kind of treatment. Why is this effective? Because if I'm a foreign investor from Germany, from the United States, from wherever, I now have a level playing field. I have now reduced the business risk of being a foreign investor in a country that has perceived corruption. It takes the process out of the local courts if I have a concern from the local courts, and takes the influence of the local government, but it also puts affirmative obligations on the government. These international arbitration, again, is governed by treaties, and there's a couple of treaties that are particularly important. One's called the New York Convention, and the other one's called the ICSID, or the Washington Convention, and here's what they do. They're signed by, the New York Convention is signed by 172 countries, and if you can put up slide number 3 in the PowerPoint, these are the signatory countries that have signed these various conventions. These are the countries that say we will recognize each other's arbitration awards. So, for example, if there's an arbitration award against Macedonia or for Macedonia, every one of these countries will enforce it if Macedonia or the investor has assets in that country. What does that mean? That if there's, let's say, a payment in US dollars that's coming from Houston to Macedonia, or a payment coming from Germany to Macedonia, using the US example, I can go to a New York state court and get an order to an intermediary bank that if there's any payment going to the government of Macedonia, it will be arrested on the spot. And I will get notice without notifying the government saying, I just arrested $25,000. Do you want to keep it? No. Go again. Now there's a payment of $3 billion going to someone. Do you want that? Yes. And they'll arrest it immediately. And now the government has to show up in a New York federal court and explain why it should be released and not used to pay that foreign arbitration award. All of a sudden, enforcement doesn't come under the Macedonian judiciary, but it comes to the countries that have signed this, and they, by law, are required to recognize arbitration awards and to enforce them. Why is that important? Remember, when you have a private person, I'm an arbitrator in some cases. I don't have an army, I don't have the sheriff, I don't have the ability to go to your house and make me pay. But what an investor will do is go to the local court, convert my award into a judgment, and that country will use its laws to take the money, the asset, a rig, whatever that the Macedonia, whoever is being sued, has in that country and use to pay that foreign investor without interfering or using the local court. That is a huge hammer. The other thing under the ICSID Convention is it's run by the World Bank, and the World Bank may withhold loans to the country if it doesn't comply with its arbitration obligations. Another huge hammer. So if I'm a foreign investor, now I have options to minimize my business risk, to make sure that what I'm owed is paid. And by the way, there are firms that specialize in this kind of enforcement. My firm, for example, represents the victims of the Madoff Ponzi scheme. For those of you that don't know, Bernie Madoff had a Ponzi scheme where he would ask people for investment, particularly Jewish investors. And if you gave him $1,000, he would pay the second investor using your $1,000, but there was actually no return. And the whole thing collapsed. Billions of dollars lost. My firm was hired to collect the money for the victims. We've gone to over 130 countries and have collected $14.5 billion, have appeared in nearly every court in the world to get this money back, recovered 70 cents on the dollar. People specialize. The best example I've heard of this, if I want to find your money, but people are good at hiding money. we will subpoena Amazon, using your example, and your daughter bought a purse on Amazon. According to the Amazon records, how was that purse paid for? By credit card, Citibank. Okay, subpoena Citibank. How does Citibank get paid for the credit card bills? Bank of America. Let's subpoena Bank of America. Where's your money coming from? It's very easy to trace the money, follow the money, and collecting on these judgments, collecting on these arbitration awards that are converted to judgments is now become really a state of art in the legal profession. But it's also a tool for the government. Here's why. Going back to the corruption index, it attracts investors. It attracts investors because I now have a right, not only under the contract, but under treaties. As I said, Macedonia signed 42 bilateral investment treaties, and each one of them has a different standard of treatment. Some will say, I will treat you the same as I treat a Macedonian investor. Some will say, I will treat you better than Macedonian investors, and I will give them rights that Macedonian investors don't. And some give something called the most favored nation treatment, meaning that, let's say this is a treaty using the German example, that Germany has a most favored nations treatment. So if the German investment is taken away, Germany now gets to look at the 42 other treaties that Macedonia has signed with Vietnam, Qatar, whoever else, and choose that treatment for their investment. Incredible, powerful tool. Now, the problem with corruption is it can be used both as a sword and a shield. Obviously, for the investor, it's a sword, because if you say, the government took away my investment, I now have a sword in a way to fight back. But for the government, it's also a shield. How do these prior people that came in, how did they get the contract? Did they get it through corruption? Did the foreign investor bribe somebody to get an illegal contract? It is a complete defense when the country is sued in international arbitration to say, that's an illegal contract. That is an illegal contract that was not obtained following Macedonian law, and we are not obligated to follow it. And I think the message the government can basically send is, we're a safe place to invest. The reason is this: we're going to follow the rules. And think of it in terms of any business that has success eventually gets sued. I think that's certainly true in America. And if you're being sued by your best customer, you're going to treat that very differently than if you're being sued by your investor. So if Macedonia is sued by a company that has an investment, that values that investment, that wants to keep that investment, I think they send a message to foreign investors by the way they treat claims against the government when that valuable investor sues. For example, under the Exit Convention, there's a cooling off period. There's a certain number of time, I believe it's 60 days, maybe longer, but each treaty has a different cooling off period where neither party can do anything. It's an opportunity to negotiate. So imagine you're a business and you've been sued by your best customer and you want to keep that relationship. You want to keep the mining concession alive. You want to keep the deal alive. You want to keep the investment still in Macedonia. This is an opportunity to negotiate. I'll give you the concession, but we have to change the prices. There's a reason that we had a problem with the concession. So why don't we negotiate a further profit for you on the back end, but you'll make a further investment in the country now. You can make it right, and the message that sends to investors is, we're going to treat this like a commercial relationship, and we're going to come up with the best solution. If it's a competitor, in other words, using my example before, somebody that got their contract by bribing a foreign official, if you're a company and somebody bribed your best salesman to get a contract and got outrageous deals, you would say, this is not an enforceable contract. He didn't have the authority for that deal. He obtained that contract by illegal means, and we're not going to honor it because we do business honestly. We don't tolerate corruption, we don't enforce corruption, and we don't allow contracts to go forward with corruption. So that contract is not enforceable, and the government is fully protected. I think what you need is, I had a client once said to me, and frankly, this is experience over 30 years of practice, clients don't care at all about legal theories. They want commercial solutions. And I think international arbitration is a tool for foreign investors and the government to create partnerships, to create commercial solutions, and basically combat corruption by using this really unique international arbitration process.
Thank you, Sasha, and I hope this next government hires you, as the current government estimated that we lost by the previous government between 500 million and 5 billion euros in 11 years. I don't know how much we lost in these 7 years of this government, but there are a lot of money to be traced and recovered. Unfortunately, this government only recovered 1 million and they said they'll put up a counter on the Triumphal Arch there, but it never worked as there were nothing to show. So hopefully that changes, and maybe you help in that. Think about later on when we have time for questions that there are 2 questions about why to trace all these payments, why not to use cryptocurrency when we have it now. So think about it, but we move to the last issue, let's say with Jason Corley here, about the cultural aspect of the corruption and cultural challenges, and that we saw what is the perception, and I told you that almost everybody which is asked for a bribe thinks it's better to pay it to finish the job, to get the job done, instead of waiting long days and months to get some permit in a regular way that might never come. So what are the challenges in corruption when you see it, how it works in the United States, and then you come here and hear all these very different cultural elements, let's say, of the corruption, that is very accepted and the resistance is very low. How you deal and what is your experience with effective strategies of changing that behavior, let's say, or understanding of corruption in the country?
So I've been thinking about this, and I think that ultimately it comes down to people believing in the country and believing in the system. And I think people tend to remember stories better than just talking about principles. And I'm from Texas, so I like to tell stories. So I'm just going to tell a story for a minute. Because I thought about this, and I think this is the best answer that I can give. A number of years ago, when I was working in South Texas, for those of you who are not familiar, South Texas, there's a river, the Rio Grande River, that divides Texas from Mexico, and I lived about a mile from that river. There were nights when I was there with my family that if we were out front, we could hear the machine gun fire across the river from Matamoros with the cartel battles that were going on. It's still violent, but at the time that I was down there, it was hyper-violent, but significantly more violent across the river. It's just a river dividing people. The population isn't really all that different. In South Texas, especially in Brownsville, the population is 96% Tejano, Mexican-American. It's Spanish-speaking. It's just a river dividing it. And so I want to share vaguely the perspective of a cartel boss on a culture of corruption. So there was a case that a friend of mine prosecuted where he indicted the son of a major cartel leader in Mexico. And apparently, the son put out a hit to have my friend killed. And it was called off by the defendant, the person who had been charged, the defendant's father, who ran the cartel. And apparently, the reason that he called it off, he gave 2 reasons for it. The first is those prosecutors in the United States, this is apparently what was said, those prosecutors in the United States have integrity and they do the job right, and we don't kill people like that. That's first. And second, do you have any idea what would happen down here if you killed him? It would destroy our business. They would send the damn army down here. Okay? And I think that encapsulates how to correct a culture of corruption. You have to believe in the people doing the job. They have to have integrity and character, and they have to do it for the right reasons, and the bad guys have to be afraid of the consequences. And I think it's that simple, and I don't even need to talk that much longer about it.
And there is a broader debate, even me and Mike discussed about impunity and chasing or blaming the previous government officials instead of focusing of reforms and not really get obsessed by that. And there is one question about that, not to blame the government or so. I'll actually go back to you because you're coming from the United States Embassy, and I've mentioned all this funding that is coming to our country. So, what are your expectations? How to that, especially of the new government, how to tackle corruption, and what would be the expected results in the, let's say, this term of coming 4 years? And the similar questions is for Mark. how long it would take for new Macedonian government to implement all this digitalization, and especially in relation to fighting corruption. So whoever wants to start from the two of you, or even Sashe can join. Yeah.
You want me to start it? Or it doesn't matter to me. Go for it.
So I think one important asset that Macedonia has, and you are a living testament to that, is an incredible diaspora. You have amazing young people who studied at top universities around the world who need to be pulled back by being basically offered top positions, not just in your leading corporates, but also in judiciary, public service, and so on. It's all about strengthening the institutions. Your private sector is very vibrant, your entrepreneurs are incredible, but it's the public institutions that lack credibility and efficiency. What we did in Slovenia, and I'm very happy about that, we managed to bring one of our most respected international legal scholars back from abroad. He has a PhD from Harvard and Oxford, and now he sits on our constitutional court. He's one of the best judges. He's not the only one, but you know, it takes a concerted effort to bring these people back, simply because their alternatives abroad are so much better. So they need to be offered an opportunity to deliver real change, to create an impact, not just to have a title that sounds good. So I think this should be top priority of this government, bringing in some of the, you know, incredible brains that Macedonia has around the world. And you know, when we're talking about corruption, I think the perception is different across different generations. You know, a couple of generations ago, they called corruption as generosity, as part of culture. Luckily, our generation is very different. We hate it. And that's why I have hope, not just that, you know, things will improve thanks to the actions of the new government, but especially because of the new generation that has a very different attitude towards corruption. You asked me about digital transformation and implementing the two tools that I mentioned, meaning the digital government app and platform, as well as the digital procurement platform, give or take 2 years, if the government starts working on it in the next couple of months. It's all there. These efforts are actually very generously supported by the US government and USAID, for which I'm grateful. And I've been working with USAID on a number of cases around the world in implementing this project. It has been done, it can be done, and it will be done.
Thank you, and I hope we have representatives from the upcoming government in the audience, and this challenge of 2 years to actually do it and digitalize. I know we have quite a lot of resources locally because there are many Macedonian companies working out, as outsourced software companies for American market and others, so we can do it here. But also I think one of the reasons for existence of Macedonia 2025 is exactly what you are saying, to link the brains that are out of the country and to help the country improve. So Jason, back on the question, we know what are our expectations, that we reduce and at least a bit improve on this scale of corruption, but what, especially with so big investment in anti-corruption, what are US government expectations in the fight against corruption from including upcoming governments?
I mean, from my perspective, I think as I mentioned earlier, with the judiciary, valuing the independence of the prosecution offices and the judiciary in as non-political positions. You know, back home, somewhere in a storage facility, I don't know where, is my deputization, and it's signed by Eric Holder. That was who hired me with the Department of Justice, and I worked. I met him once, but I didn't really work for him, right? He was high up in the government. But in the 10 years that I've been with the Department of Justice, I've had 5 United States attorneys that I've worked for, including acting U.S. attorneys. I've worked for Attorney General Eric Holder, Jeff Sessions, Bill Barr, and now Merrick Garland. And it's been a change in political parties, and it's been a change in partisanship, and none of it ever has affected my work. And I think that my hope is that North Macedonia values the the importance of an independent prosecution office and judiciary to do the job ethically and legally.
Well, thank you, and good luck to all of us with all of that. And hopefully we get. And Sashe, maybe in the last 2 minutes, we have a lot of money to recover, let's say, and you pointed out maybe to highlight some case, and I'll mention to link what Mark said about public companies. So one of the most mentioned in the public and by NGOs in Macedonia is the Regbitol energy company that contracts, government contracts of public company for excavating the coal, is actually one of the main flow of money to political parties or to corrupted politicians. Second, which is linking actually American companies, these corridors that we are building, that people are saying the last one we made was 6.3 million per kilometer. Now we are contracting a company for 15 million per kilometer, and obviously there is no logic in that. So how to tackle these issues, to get into the details and try to recover some of this money that are already spent on probably corrupted cases.
You know, I have 1 minute, 4 seconds left to answer that. What I found something interesting, what you were talking about, is the Metamoris example, that there's consequences. Yeah. And I think there's a definitive plan for the government to use. You know, there are consequences, and international arbitration imposes very heavy ones. The idea being that there's recent claims that have been filed against the government where the claims went from 10 million to now over $1 billion. Imagine if that company is successful. I'm not talking about the merits of it and whether it has any merits to it. But if Macedonia is forced to pay $1 billion, it would cripple the national budget. So the question is, what do you do? And I think the country's already started to take some steps. My understanding is that there was a law in the past that if a government official is tied to a bad contract, he was prosecuted criminally. As a lawyer, what that means is my best witness won't talk to me because they want to completely disassociate themselves from the process. That law's changed, where now all of a sudden we can work together. I think to recover money from the past, I think there has to be due diligence. I think there has to be consequences for the people, not criminal consequences, but certainly civil consequences and possibly criminal consequences, because if you're acting criminally, you get severe consequences, severe punishment. But the government's perception, and I keep going back to the word, the perception that the government has to give is that we're going to take affirmative steps. We're not going to tolerate it. And we're going to make it easier for companies to do business, but we're also going to make it easier to defend ourselves. So that when there's been money taken from the government illegally in the past due to past corruption, we're going to create a process that makes it easier for the government to recover that money, to follow that money, and to be able to recover it without putting the handcuffs on the lawyers and the people who are trying to achieve that result.
Well, thank you. And that's nicely wraps up this session, as Mark has to run to catch the plane. And Macedonia 2025 prefers punctuality. With this, I'm closing this session and thank our panelists and you for giving us a lot of food for thought, especially for the new government to do a lot of things in the coming years. Thank you.